Hello, welcome back from lunch. Thank you for making it. That was the only bit of audience participation you'll be glad to hear. I personally don't enjoy it when I pay a lot of money for a ticket and then have to do the entertaining myself. So I'll try and keep it simple. Just wait for these people to come in. So I and Cognisco are really interested in what people really know. I'm not so interested in which facts they can recall, but I'm really interested to understand and to evidence what people truly know and how they are likely to apply that knowledge. And if they're likely to apply that knowledge consistently and accurately and in accordance with policy, process and procedure, regardless of how the world changes around them. And in the world we're operating in today, that's quite a challenge, I think you'd agree, especially if we think about regulated businesses. So we're really interested in people's current level of competence. We're also interested in people's current level of confidence. I want to know that I have a competent and confident workforce. I want to know that they are consistently confident in applying the policies, the procedures and the processes in the way that I need them to for my business to operate effectively. And that's what we do at Cognisco. We correlate competence with confidence and we identify the gaps in between. We often find we have some people who are highly confident and highly competent. What's interesting about that is we don't always know who they are until we examine them, until we ask the real question. There's also a percentage of the audience who are perhaps very confident but not currently competent. And I think that presents a risk to the organisation, and that's what we're interested in. So when we assess or baseline an organisation, and these are very rolled up analytics, but you'll get the point, on average, we find broadly 30% of any population has some level of misplaced confidence in their own capability or competence, which presents a risk. And that could be a risk to them, to the people that they seek to serve, or to the organisation. And that's a really consistent figure. It doesn't mean to say that they're going to go out there and deliberately do something wrong, but they misunderstand something that you would consider important. And there are some interesting reasons behind that. Perhaps more happily, there are always, consistently, broadly 20% who are both competent and confident. The problem most organisations have is they don't know who they are or where they are because we never ask the right questions. Also, quite interestingly, sometimes those people don't know who they are because they're in the wrong job or they don't have the right level of authority or they weren't asked the right questions. So sometimes it's quite an epiphany for that individual to discover they're actually really good at something that's really important and valuable to the company. But we keep asking them the wrong questions. I'm sure you can do the maths. Broadly, 50% then of the remaining population have some kind of immediate learning requirement. So we've immediately got a level of triage here that says, do we need to put everybody through the same learning process over and over again? If we want to ensure we've got a competent and capable workforce, and that is the exam question, by the way, from the regulator and from the business, then perhaps we can be a bit smarter than that. Perhaps if we have an analytic that looks at things in a slightly different way, we can direct people to the most appropriate learning or intervention to mitigate or to remediate the gap. Let's just go back and get on the same page about conscious competence. Fairly well understood 4 stages of learning. I think that arguably goes back as far as Socrates. Or so he told me once. So we start with the fact that we don't know what we don't know. We are unconsciously incompetent. These people are inherently dangerous, usually because they don't see the value or the need for training or for learning. Okay, but pretty much we can draw a box around them in an organisation because they're the new people. So although they're inherently dangerous, we know who they are and where they are. Then we have conscious incompetence, these people who now know that they don't know, so they're slightly less risky. So I'm not going to go and defuse the bomb because I've not had the training. Probably pretty safe. We've then got conscious competence, and these are really good people. These are the people that you want in your organisation who are both consciously are capable but know they're capable. And I always equate this to people who have quite recently passed their driving test. So they can drive the car, they're very currently aware of the rules of the road, and because they've only just really learnt it, they've constantly got their eyes open for the hazards that they were pointed out to them all the way through their learning. So they're consciously aware of what's going on, and they're applying that continuously. And they build on that knowledge till they get to this level, the unconscious competent. If you are American and you're a psychologist, you call this automaticity. I think that's a really hideous word, but there we go. It means that we now do this stuff intuitively. We've been doing it for so long now that it's just something we do every day. And you might consider that's how you drive your car every day from A to B. You can just do it now, you don't think about it. I don't think that is a linear scale, however. I don't think it goes upwards like that and we stop there. I think it's slightly more scary than that. And our experience and analytics go to show that it's actually a cycle. Those two areas there, 2 and 3, are quite interesting, but actually it's 1 and 4. It's the new people into the organisation that we need to be aware of, but it's also the people who've been in the role or the function for a very long period of time. And that's because they've gone past conscious competence, now they do things intuitively. And there is a point at which doing things intuitively and becoming automatic in your approach to things, that means it presents a risk. Interestingly, these people who have been doing the same thing for a long time tend to be quite senior very often. They tend to have been promoted into a position. They're very often team leaders. They're very often the most vocal people in any group. They are the people to whom everybody else gravitates. They're also, interestingly, the people who found the operational workarounds. That's a euphemism for not following the process or procedure. And that's where you start to get the divergence between what the Chief Executive Office and the Chief Risk Officer sees as work as imagined and what the reality is of work as performed, how it's actually working on the shop floor day to day. People do stuff to make their life easier. And if they can do things to get around the process, the procedure, or the policy, and they never really get caught out, then that's what we do in my department. And then new people coming from here have just come out of training, come to join us, and we say, yeah, we know, yeah, they do that. They teach that when you first join. But do you know what? We just do this. It's always been fine. Nothing's ever gone wrong. And sometimes, that's fine, isn't it? Until something goes wrong, and then the regulator or the press or the customer base or the shareholders say, well, actually, what's going on here? We've got really experienced people. They've been doing the same job for a long time. Oh, yeah, that's a good point. They've been doing the same job for a long time in exactly the same way, and the world around them has changed. And if we go back to the driving test analogy, and we consider that from that perspective, I'm quite old, so I took my driving test probably 30 years ago, and you might argue that over that time I've got quite a lot of experience of driving a car, so I can make it work and go forward and backwards, and I tend not to hit things. But it was about 30 years ago that I last read a copy of the Highway Code, and I would imagine most of us are like that. And I'd like to think that some rules at least had changed in the intervening 30 years. I haven't kept myself up to date at all. So am I consciously competent? Am I truly aware of the rules of the road and what I should be doing and how I should be responding? I'd probably argue not. And we consider we all have to take risks in our day-to-day life. That's probably not a big risk. But now consider if I'm driving the school bus, or if I decide I want to rent a digger, or I want to drive a train. Is that probably important that the people who hold those jobs in society are constantly assessed to ensure they constantly know how to apply the current rules and regulations? Not just that they can remember what they were, but that they can apply them when it's wet. They can apply them when it's snowy. They can apply them when they're tired and when they've just had an argument with their husband or wife or boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever. Are we happy about that, or should we just let it slide? Well, actually, what we're doing, I suggest, is letting it slide. And that presents a significant risk to everybody in society, not just to the learner, but to everybody. Fortunately, you don't need to take my word for it. Dunning-Kruger effect's quite an interesting piece of research in 1999. They effectively established that typically the people with the lowest level of capability have the highest level of confidence. Peter Principle. Black box thinking, if you haven't read it, it's part of your duty, I think, as a human being to read that book. It's about understanding how we learn from failure, how businesses, organisations learn from failure, how if we promote a learning culture where we can raise our hand and admit when something's gone wrong, that's how we learn. That's the difference between the airline industry and the IT industry. That's the difference between the airline industry and, sadly, the NHS. Big fan of the NHS though I am, and struggling though they are to achieve it, they do not report on incidents in the way that the airline industry does. And that's a major concern for us, because they don't have the confidence in the hierarchy to be able to raise their hand and say, actually, I've spotted something going wrong. And actually, Matthew Syed's book starts with a story about Martin Bromley and his wife, who sadly died during a routine operation when some of the most experienced surgeons were in the room. And they forgot to do the basics. And they were so focused on automaticity that they didn't do the basics. The most junior person in the room knew they needed a tracheostomy, but she didn't have the confidence to raise the issue. And his wife died. And it's that simple. And it gets brushed under the carpet in those kinds of organisations because the hierarchy is dominant. Highly, highly competent people, you think. Automaticity, it's a killer. Peak by Anders Ericsson, stunning book. This is about, the research goes back 30, 40 years really, and this is about how people learn and how people gain expertise. And effectively he says it's about purposeful practice. Unless we're helping people learn and continuously practice, constantly straining and stressing them, and asking them to reevaluate and test themselves, then they stop being expert. They go into automaticity. And he sees it like this. In fact, there's a lot of evidence going back. He works in the US in surgeons, and we're hoping to do some work with him in the next couple of years. Effectively, what he managed to show was the longer you've been doing the role or the function, especially if you're expert at it, you take a surgeon, for example, they train and stress themselves, constantly stress testing, all the way through their career until they make it, and then they stop. And then effectively, they're on a production line. So you've got people who are constantly learning, constantly checking, constantly testing, now just doing the same thing over and over again, and automaticity creeps in. And what he's been able to prove is that as your career goes up like this in that kind of role, and as everybody tells you you're brilliant and your confidence goes up because nothing goes wrong, actually your current level of competence drops off. He was able to prove that somebody straight out of medical school was arguably more competent than a surgeon that had been practicing for 30 years. I've got a friend who is an anaesthetist and actually a customer of ours, and he sees this often in his own practice. He says he will ask one of his students to tell him what the current level of thinking is, what the current ideas are around a particular process or procedure, and they are too scared to tell him because of the hierarchy. And he's genuinely asking because he wants to know. So we have to be aware of whether people are confident in the application of that knowledge and whether they're competent, because a combination of somebody who thinks they know what they're doing and is very senior and is very dominant but actually is not up to speed is dangerous. Some instances that's about life and death. In some instances it's about share price. In some instances it's about customer satisfaction. This is how it manifests typically when you get out of the, dare I say, the weeds of L&D and HR, and you get up into the chief exec's office. This is how it manifests. 30% broadly of your organisation present some kind of risk in these areas. Organisations that focus on health and safety, oil and gas, and any kind of high resilience areas typically think that they have this nailed because they constantly refer to it and they ask people to take memory tests. The test, can you recall what the process and procedure is? And they have very large mitigation funds for when things go wrong. The NHS has a mitigation fund of £27 billion a year. That's what it sets aside because it knows that things go wrong and it has to pay out every single year. £27 billion. It spends £100,000 a minute on training. And it has no measure as to whether any of that is working. The same is not true in the airline industry, and that's because they learn from failure. So mitigation funds are not the answer. Compliance, the world of compliance is changing. It's not just people in dark suits anymore. This now affects our day-to-day life. Interestingly, the regulator in pretty much every industry has started to turn their attention beyond process and procedure and is now asking about culture, behaviour, attitude, the application of the knowledge. I was reading a report just this morning, kindly sent to me, thank you Mary, that said the FCA rule handbook, actually the handbook costs more than a second-hand Mini Cooper. I think it's quite interesting. But actually, they don't know how to measure culture or behaviour any more than anybody else does. But that's what they're asking for now. I'm sure Lloyds can tell you some about that. Yeah? If you think about the healthcare sector, the CQC are now saying a record of attending training is no longer acceptable I sound like Super Nanny, acceptable as evidence of competence. And Andrea Sutcliffe, who runs the care sector of the CQC, says, I want to see, these are her words, a capable and confident workforce. And they don't know how to measure that because the way they're being driven right now is to measure attendance, bums on seats, and recall of facts. And why are they asking for those things? Because those things impact our daily lives. Somebody who knows the rules but can't apply them or isn't confident in applying them, that's specifically the case in the healthcare sector, really challenging for them, where people just revert back to policy because they're too scared to care give, because care give is about giving risk. So policy, procedure, and process is not about stifling people, it's about empowering people to do their job and to do it confidently. My favourite is reputational risk, because it's the risk that keeps on giving. And in the world that we live in today of social media, you just never know when it's going to stop delivering. I probably don't need to bring to your attention engineering companies, retailers, bankers, others who've been in the press recently around reputation. The reason this gets attention is because there is no mitigation fund large enough to cope with the potential damage of reputational risk. And the CEO's head rolls when things go wrong. Because the shareholders get upset, because the customers get upset. And because social media is out there telling everybody about it, it never goes away. You can't draw a box around it, pay a fine and walk away. So all of these things tree up to reputational risk. And when you consider at least 30% of your people don't know what to do, or rather haven't got the confidence to apply it consistently, then that's a big exposure. Think about the banking world, people trading in different cultures, different environments. Well, we do it differently here. Do you? Well, your banking license says you have to perform consistently in the same way. Interesting. How are you going to cope with that? So it's a really interesting area. One of the reasons why most organizations still have a problem with this is because of this insight gap. Pretty much every organization has one of these, an LMS structure, an HR structure, and they have data around all of those kinds of things. And then over here, on the other side of the business, they have slightly grayer people and very much more established systems. Risk systems are actually made out of iron girders. They've been around for a very, very long time. They're very mature systems. HR systems, less so, I would argue. Over here in the business, we have all our lovely data about people and all the learning they've been on, all the training they've done. And over here, we have all the information we've got about processes. And there's the problem. There's a chasm between the two. The two systems don't talk. So it's great down here for the learner. It's great down here for the learning and development people and for the HR people until the chief risk officer or the CRO or the COO or anybody else is going to end up in prison for getting this wrong. Or, in fact, the shareholders said, do your people really understand your process? And can you prove that they are capable of being able to apply those processes consistently? The answer is no, because this is a chasm between the two. I'm not making that up. This is, oh, look, there we are. The regulator and the market are quite interested in that too. Chartists are analysts in the risk and governance space. They look at all the technology in risk and governance space, and they say, and this is the iron girder side of business, they say our systems are no longer fit for purpose because they do not consider people and the actions, attitudes, behaviours of people. That's the most established part of the risk industry, saying we're not getting this right anymore. We need to come over to you guys in the HR and L&D function. What information, what data can you give us? Actually, I don't think we can. And the reason I don't think we can is because most of the time we are being driven to evidence that people have turned up. Then we're driven to give evidence that people can recall the facts we asked them, or rather the facts we told them 20 minutes ago. And I think that's great if you're selling training. It's not great if your life depends on it. We work with occupational psychologists, and the way that we do things ensure there is no cognitive bias. We're not directing people any way, one way or another. A multiple choice test or a memory recall test literally means, can you recall what we've just told you? And a little hint, usually the third one in is the right answer if you want to pass one, and definitely the one with the most amount of text is always the right answer in a multiple choice test. Okay? Not terribly robust, is it? It doesn't measure what people are going to do. It doesn't measure what they understand. It doesn't measure how they're going to apply it. It doesn't measure what happens if they have had an argument with their husband or wife or spouse. It doesn't measure anything other than can they remember what you just told them. In our line of work, we focus a slightly different, we favour a slightly different approach. We use scenario-based questioning, where we effectively take people into a scenario they would recognise in their day-to-day role or function. It can be in narrative. Very often it's in video. We do work with KPMG in their academies. But the most important part of this is situational judgment. Put yourself in a situation you recognise. And it's multiple response evaluation. So I'm not going to ask you to pick one of these and say which one do you think is right. I'm going to ask you to assess each one of these responses in turn and in isolation with regard to that scenario. So what do you think of this scenario? What do you think of this response to this scenario? Tell me whether you think it's correct or incorrect, and then tell me how confident you are in your answer. And now look at this response and do the same thing, and this, and this, and this. This is why we use occupational psychologists, because this really proves whether you know what you're talking about. Because all of these could be right, all of them could be wrong. If you don't really know, they will look like they're contradicting each other. So this really pulls it out. And of course, if you're highly confident, but actually wrong most of the time, that's how we get the risk. And we break out quite a deep analytic that enables us to say, obviously, the shades of grey, etc., right the way through from, actually, this is a high-risk area for you. I'm not saying you're wholly a high-risk individual. We're saying this particular area you don't really understand, so that we can better direct the intervention or learning resource to remediate that gap. And the granularity here. The interesting one for me here is the light green. These are people who have a very high level of competence, but a slightly lower level of confidence. They are your future rising stars or your team leaders, but they don't know it. And I would argue that if they don't know it, then they're exposed, because they could be talked around by somebody who potentially is more confident than they are. So you need to know who they are, and then you need to find the right intervention. Sometimes it's a cup of tea and a chat. You don't necessarily need to do the 3-week training course or read the process manual again. If we change the way that we train people, we change the cadence and the frequency of the training, then we change the culture. A lot of what we do currently says we'll put everybody through some form of training, and then we'll assess them just to check that they can remember it. What we like to do is say, why don't we assess first of all to see where you have a specific learning gap. Then we'll show you where that specific learning gap is, and we'll direct you to the right resource, the right response, the right intervention to remediate that gap. Because you're a busy human being. You probably don't want to be doing this all day. This works particularly well in compliance, by the way. And we'll direct you to the policy manual, to the video, whatever it is you need to do to remediate the gap, and you can assess again. But if you ask people to reflect on policy, process, and procedure consistently across the year, rather than asking them on day 364 of the year, if you ask them to reflect on it every day, then you find it's what they think about, talk about, engage in, act on, because we're talking about it. Culture in an organisation is what we do, what we act, how we act, how we behave, and what we talk about. Well, why don't we present the things that we want people to do on a regular basis to them? Isn't it interesting? We ask people to think about compliance. If we're thinking about compliance, if we can think about anything, think about compliance one day of a year, and then we check to make sure they've got broadly 80% right, and then we're not so worried about the 364 remaining days of the year. Interesting. So my assertion is that you can change the way that people feel about what you're asking them to do, how you're asking them to behave, by asking them to reflect on it frequently, to change the cadence. 5 minutes or 5 seconds? 5 more examples? 5? Let me give you some examples. I'm going to go hugely into case studies because we can talk about them afterwards if you like. For me, this is a really important one. This is in the care sector. And Belong are one of the leading dementia groups. And they built some fantastic training around dementia, and everybody loved it. The problem was they weren't quite getting the results they thought they should be getting, because the feedback from the training was fantastic. And that's because it was a very immersive experience. It's a truly emotional experience, and the trainer was absolutely fantastic. The problem was people didn't know how to apply it when they went back into the workplace. Because in the workplace, they're faced with very different scenarios. Or, as we were able to evidence here, they were faced by different line managers who had a slightly different view of how things should work. In care, frankly, you're either a KPI-driven person that says everyone needs to be out and fed and watered and dressed and looking shiny, or we don't really care what they look like as long as they're happy. You're pretty much at one end of the spectrum or the other. And so depending on how you were being driven by your line manager, you would behave differently. But because they only did this once a year, because the training itself was so expensive, they ended up with big gaps in areas on person-centered care, frankly, which is what they were taking to market. They weren't delivering on their customer promise. So we changed the way they did it, we changed the cadence, so frequency, how frequently they did it, and we changed the things that they reflected on and put them in scenarios. And that enabled them to take people into a more reflective experience. It transformed the way that they work. The ops director was quite interesting. The ops director said it takes about 3 years to build a reputation in the care sector and about 3 minutes to lose it. And what was happening was that her staff were reverting to policy because they were too afraid to take the risk to give care, because they weren't empowered by process and policy because they didn't understand how to apply it. John Lewis, we've been working with now for, it could be even as many as 8 years, and what's really interesting about this for me is this is the back end of the supply chain. John Lewis were trying to, and it's the back end of the supply chain, by the way, the bit that touches the customer, we typically spend the least amount of money on in an organisation, just worth considering. Right? So John Lewis there, trying to change the way that their customer service works. The last mile of the customer service engagement usually is through a lorry driver. And the lorry driver was very often an outsourced third-party contractor in a white van who didn't really carry the John Lewis brand, and they wanted to transform that. And they wanted to transform the way the lorry drivers felt about their job, and so they wanted to upskill them to offer different services, hanging a TV, plumbing in a washing machine, whatever, as part of their career development. And we transformed the way they think about this because we've now created an environment in which the depots compete. So they compete to be the best customer service people. They never thought they would see that. And now because they reflect on consistently on scenario-based behaviours, actually they're applying and working the way that John Lewis want them to. Sadly, we've had a few complaints, though, which came from the rest of the business that said, why aren't we getting assessed like this? We want it, which I thought was quite nice. The NHS, we're doing more work in the NHS now. We started out with UCLH. They had problems in maternity, sadly, serious untoward incidents, and the biggest challenge there was the confidence of the midwife to challenge upwards. If they saw something going wrong, would they challenge the consultant? Equally, the EQ, the emotional intelligence of the consultant, did they have the emotional intelligence to recognise the challenge upwards? Because people were dying, frankly. They were incurring heavy fines and their insurance premiums were through the roof. We changed the way they felt about training, we changed the cadence, and we changed the way they applied it. So, yeah, these are the two references that, if you're interested in, I suggest that's a kind of legal obligation as a human being, at least the first one you need to read as a member of society, but they're both brilliant, yeah. And we're hoping to work with Anders in the next couple of years to do some work in the US to further prove his pieces. Nearly done, honest. So here's my roundup. Is that about on time? Right. So the unconscious incompetent is not necessarily as sexy as some of the fantastic technology you will see today, but if you don't understand it and you can't identify it, it will kill you. Quite literally, potentially, especially if you're in bomb disposal. And it's something that the business is asking for. So let's not forget the exam question. While we're here to give the learner a fantastic experience, our responsibility to the customers, to the service users, to the shareholders, to the business, is to deliver a constantly competent and capable workforce. Recall testing is not fit for purpose, full stop, sorry. You need to rethink it. That insight gap is very real and very present, and real grown-ups who've been doing this for a long time in the risk function are now starting to recognise it. And trust me, when people that grey really get excited about it, and we were at a conference the other day about global risk and compliance, and they said, in their view, the biggest issue for businesses was not how shiny and perfect the processes was. It was almost 100% the problem now is the people. They don't have the tools for that. That's the opportunity in the learning world for me. I mean, for us, I don't mean for me personally, obviously. Evidence-based targeting decision-making makes much better use of the resources you currently have. I know Lloyd's are going to be talking about sweating the learning assets rather elegantly. we've already got some of this stuff here, but if we can direct people to the most relevant piece of learning, most relevant intervention, not only are we delivering the best value back to the user, to the learner, but the best value back to the business. So when you're asked again about ROI on learning, this is the way you can do it. So have a think about a model that says assess first, learn to remediate the gap, and then reassess. That's a better journey for everybody. It's much more cost effective. And then I'll just leave you with a bit from Mark Twain, who says it much more elegantly than I do. It ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And I think that's pretty true. I hope that's been useful. Thank you very much.
We do have a few moments, about 5-10 minutes for questions. So I have a few written down, but I want to offer it to the audience. So I know you've practiced raising your arms already, so it's not for the will of raising your arms. But I want more than one question, so I will come into the audience and ask you one anyway. But here we go. So the first question for Owen.
Hi. Thanks very much for that. It was actually quite insightful for me. I'm not an L&D professional, so I actually come from a construction and operational type background.
Fantastic. Yep.
And I've just joined the L&D group. So my questions might be naive and the answer might be obvious, so forgive me.
I hope so.
So you mentioned something about process and procedures empowering people. Do you have one of your best examples of that you could share?
Yeah, I mean, the best one I think that immediately springs to mind, I'm sure there will be thousands of others, but the one that immediately springs to mind is the care sector. So you've got people who are potentially the lowest paid people in society with one of the most responsible jobs. We entrust them with the people we love. And if they're going to give care that is effective, they have to have the confidence to not just revert back to policy and process, because policy and process is there to defend the shareholder, not the service user. So in the care sector, they were saying, well, I daren't take a risk and allow this resident to sit around in the pajamas all day, or tear up paper, or stand staring at the wall, or go out and get a paper, because the risk assessment won't allow me to do it, and it's more than my job's worth, and frankly, I'm on minimum wage, so you know what? Yeah? And so nobody wins in that scenario, because the organisation isn't giving the best care, it's not delivering on its promise, the service user certainly doesn't, the family of the service user certainly doesn't, and the individual is not able to effectively deliver on their promise, deliver on their potential as a caregiver. They're just having to follow process. So we can either use process and procedure as a fear, as a mallet to beat people with, or we can use it as something to empower people with. And I think they were only ever meant to empower people, but because everybody's been so terrified being fired for getting it wrong, if you're not careful, you'll drive people back to doing the very basics, because no one can ever get fired for following the process and procedure. But is that really what you want from your workforce? Do you want them to think a bit further than that?
So how would you change, for that particular example, the process and procedure to empower people instead of do the opposite?
It's actually what happened was we ended up rewriting the processes and procedures. They said our policies and our procedures aren't delivering value to any stakeholder other than the shareholders. And we are making, she said, I almost want to burn the books. This is what the chief operating officer said. I almost want to burn the books and start again. We have to be much more kind of user-centric or learner-centric in the way that we construct policies, so that they are more friendly in a soft way, ultimately, so that everybody can benefit from them.
I think we've got time for one more question. So,
Thank you. Excellent presentation. Thinking about automaticity in the L&D department, maybe in a team that is well embedded and comfortable and competent doing MCQ type questions. If you were to put a business case to them to say, look, we need to move to a more situational judgment-based approach of evaluation and assessment, what would the investment differential be between the two development models?
In an R&D?
No, L&D.
Oh, in L&D.
So a team that may be competent in actually developing MCQ type questions, but needs to move to this new mode of evaluating trainees. A business case would be required to invest in training for those folks so that they can competently develop accurate situational judgment
that's right.
type questions. So the question would be, I think the value is obvious, but what's the investment required in terms of in terms of costs and so on to get from one mode of development to another?
Can I say piece of string? This is not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. This is about being able to sweat the existing asset, because most organisations, LMSs breed like rabbits, right? Because they're easy to buy, and then you can tick them and done learning, right? And then the question is often asked, why have we got so many of these things? Because we're not actually really using them. So the first thing is that you're able to sweat the existing asset. You're able to direct people to much more effectively to an intervention that addresses the given need. Also, it gets people back to work quicker. So if you think about the NHS in the service environment, taking people out of service for any period of time is pretty much a no-no. And at the moment, what we do is every year we make them do mandatory training. Mandatory training is go to watch a video, then tick to say you watched it. Right? Nobody likes that. Nobody benefits from that. So there is an ROI from sweating the existing asset, and also an audit of the existing asset. We found for some very large transport companies that they've had some very deep learning expertise of LMS capability that's never been used. It looks beautiful, no one's ever used it, or when they've used it, it's had a detrimental effect on what people truly know. So I guess the first thing is about the rationalisation of the asset, the sweating of the asset, the investment in training people to be able to write situational judgment questions by training through an occupational psychologist in real terms is no real money. It's a few £1,000s. You know, then to build the analytic, you need to think about scope and scale, but I think it's about strategy, it's about premise. So start from a different premise, think about it slightly. We're changing the mindset that says we're not just testing to say, tick, they've remembered it. We have to really remember what the exam question was, because everybody benefits from going back to basics. But I'd be happy to give you a quote at some point.
And on that, on that segue,
Thank you.
just to say, Owen, thank you for a
You're very welcome.
great session.